Matilda's life had never followed the path she had once dreamed of as a young girl. She had been traded into a marriage she never asked for, sold by her father to a man she did not know. But somewhere between the first days of her arranged marriage and the years that followed, something unexpected had blossomed. Love, in its most genuine form. Not the passionate storybook kind, but something real. Something built on respect, trust, and mutual understanding. In the years following their marriage, Arthur and Matilda had created a life together. A life that was undeniably theirs, built from the ground up with sweat, patience, and shared moments of tenderness. What had once been a cold, transactional union had evolved into a true partnership. They had transformed from two strangers bound by necessity into two people who chose each other every day. As their relationship deepened, they began to consider something else: children. Though Arthur and Matilda had never been able to have biological children due to Arthur's condition, they both knew that their home could be filled with more love, more life. The decision to adopt was not one they made lightly. It was a process filled with paperwork, interviews, and waiting, things that tested their patience. But neither of them hesitated. They knew that their love had room for more, that their home could be a sanctuary for a child in need. Their first child was Ella, a little girl they had found at an orphanage. She was scared, shy, and hesitant to trust. When they first held her in their arms, Matilda felt a rush of emotions: protectiveness, tenderness, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. She knew that this child, like her, needed a place to belong, a place where she could feel safe and loved. As Matilda gazed at Ella's tiny face, she felt an indescribable bond form, an instant connection that transcended all the hardships she had endured in her own life. The adoption of Ella brought with it a new sense of purpose for Matilda. She had always believed that love was something that came with conditions, something that had to be earned or achieved. But as she looked into Ella's eyes, she realized that love didn't come with conditions. Love was something that could be given freely, without any expectation in return. It was something that could heal, transform, and build a family that defied the norms and expectations of society. Arthur, too, had embraced the idea of parenthood with open arms. While he had never known the love of a child, he had always known the loneliness of living without a family. Watching him with Ella, Matilda could see the tenderness in his eyes, the protective way he cared for her, and the way he slowly learned to open his heart to the idea of fatherhood. For Arthur, this was a new beginning, a chance to create the family he had always longed for, one built on acceptance and love. Over the next few years, Matilda and Arthur expanded their family, adopting more children. Liam, a boisterous boy who loved animals, and Mia, a sweet and quiet girl who had been abandoned at a young age. The house was filled with laughter, arguments over toys, and the noise of children growing up in a home filled with love. The transformation of their relationship from a union of convenience to one of deep affection was reflected in the home they had built. A home where love was not confined by bloodlines, where each child, no matter how they arrived, was welcomed with open arms. Matilda had never imagined she would be a mother. In her youth, she had been taught that women were meant to marry, to serve their husbands, and to bear children. But now, as a mother herself, she realized that love didn't come in just one form. Love wasn't about being born into a family. It was about creating one, about choosing to love someone and then building a life around that love. In adopting these children, Matilda had learned that love could transcend any obstacle, any expectation. It could heal the deepest wounds and fill the darkest places with light. As Matilda sat in the quiet of the house one evening, surrounded by her children and the warmth of a home she had helped create, she couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. She had started life as a powerless, traded bride, a girl whose fate had been decided by her father's will, and whose future had been handed over to a man she barely knew. She had been a prisoner of circumstances, trapped in a life that was not her own. But now, she was a woman who had built her own destiny. She had chosen her path, fought for the life she wanted, and in doing so, had created a family that was hers, not bound by obligation or tradition, but by love. Matilda had grown from the girl who was sold into marriage into a strong, respected woman, a mother, a partner, and a woman who had created something beautiful out of the most painful of beginnings. Looking around at her children, Matilda realized that her legacy would not be defined by the circumstances of her birth or the choices made for her. Her legacy would be the love she had built, the family she had created, and the strength she had found within herself. She had broken free from the chains of her past and had forged a new life, one where love was the foundation and the possibilities were limitless. The years had passed, and Matilda, now a grandmother, sat on the porch of the farmhouse she had built with Arthur. The same house that had once been a place of uncertainty and fear had transformed into a home filled with warmth, laughter, and memories. The sun had begun to dip below the horizon, casting a soft glow across the land, and the sound of children's laughter echoed from the yard. Matilda smiled as she watched her grandchildren play. Her heart swelled with love for the little ones who had brought so much joy into her life. She had never imagined, when she was a young girl, that her future could be so full of life, so full of love. She had started life as a woman whose fate was determined by the decisions of others. But now, as a grandmother, she was the one who had shaped her destiny. Her grandchildren often asked her about her past, about how she had come to be the woman they saw before them. And so, as the cool evening breeze brushed through her hair, Matilda began to tell them her story, as she had done so many times before. It wasn't always this way. "You know," she began, her voice warm with the experience of a life well lived. "There was a time when I felt like I had no control over my life. I was sold by my own father, married to a man I barely knew. My life wasn't mine to choose. I thought I had no future, that my dreams didn't matter. But I was wrong." The children gathered around her, their wide eyes filled with curiosity, eager to hear more. "I spent years thinking that love was something I couldn't have, that I was too broken, too controlled, too trapped by the world around me," Matilda continued. "But what I learned over time was that love comes in many forms. And sometimes the love you need isn't the kind that's expected. It's the kind you build with your own hands, with your own heart." Matilda paused, letting the words sink in. She looked at each of her grandchildren, their faces innocent and full of potential. "Your grandpa Arthur and I, we didn't have the perfect love story. We didn't meet by chance or fall in love with fireworks and grand gestures. But we built something together. A life, a family, and a love that grew stronger with each passing day. It wasn't always easy. There were hardships, there were doubts, and there were moments when I thought it wasn't worth it. But I was wrong. What matters is that we chose each other. And that choice, that decision, gave me the family I have today." Matilda's gaze softened as she watched the children, now playing together in the yard. She had created this life, one full of laughter, support, and understanding. She had built it on the foundation of love, love that had transformed her life and the lives of those around her. "I want you to remember this," Matilda said, her voice firm but filled with compassion. "No matter what life throws at you, no matter how hard things get, you always have the power to choose. You can choose your path. You can choose how to love, how to live, and how to rise above your circumstances. Don't let anyone else define who you are. You are the one who shapes your own future." She smiled as her grandchildren ran around, their laughter filling the air. They were free to dream, free to live, free to make their own choices. And in that moment, Matilda realized that her legacy wasn't just in the family she had built, or the love she had created. It was in the lessons she had passed down, in the strength and resilience she had instilled in her children and grandchildren. The circle of life had come full circle. She had started as a young girl with no control over her future, but now, she had become the matriarch of a family, one built on choice, love, and respect. And as the sun set on that peaceful evening, Matilda knew that her story, her journey, was not just about surviving, it was about thriving, about choosing a path that led to strength, to love, and to the freedom to live fully. No matter where you start, no matter the obstacles that come your way, you have the power to choose your own path. Your future is in your hands. Choose wisely, choose with love, and never forget that you are the author of your own story. If you've ever felt trapped by your circumstances, know that you have the power to rewrite your story. Please subscribe to hear more incredible stories of resilience and love. What would you do if your entire life was dictated by someone else's shame? Imagine being locked in a life of obedience, your every move controlled, and your fate sealed before you could even dream of freedom. This is the story of Matilda, a woman who was sold by her own father at the age of 20. Matilda's story begins in a small, weathered house in the quiet hills of Harmony Creek, Tennessee. The walls of this house, though filled with the sounds of her family, never offered her the warmth of freedom or the embrace of choice. From the moment she was born, Matilda's life had been one of quiet submission, a life shaped by the hand of a father who treated her not as his daughter, but as a treasure to be kept locked away. Her father, Walter Hayes, was a man of iron convictions, and his rules governed the household with an unyielding grip. Her earliest memories were filled with the repetitive sounds of her father's commands. "A girl's place is inside the house," he would say, never allowing her to stray far from the confines of the kitchen or the yard. The boys, Matilda's 5 older brothers, ran free, playing in the fields, climbing trees, and learning to be men. But Matilda, the youngest, the only girl, was destined for a different life. She was groomed for a future that had already been decided for her, long before she even understood the meaning of the word marriage. Her childhood was a blur of strict rules, long hours of housework, and whispered conversations between her parents. As her brothers grew older and ventured into the world, Matilda remained at home, learning how to cook, sew, and keep house. It was as though her entire existence was nothing more than preparation for a role she would have no say, in a role she had no choice but to accept. Matilda often watched her brothers leave the house with envy in her eyes. She longed for the freedom they took for granted, the ability to run, to play, to laugh without the constant supervision of her father. But every time she tried to step outside, to follow them into the world, her father's voice would ring through the house like a chain pulling her back. "A girl's place is not in the streets," he would say. "You stay in here where you belong." And so, she stayed, trapped within the walls of her father's home, unable to break free from the life he had designed for her. As she grew older, the weight of these expectations grew heavier. At the age of 10, Matilda understood that she was different. Her father's voice, though often loving, had a coldness to it when it came to her future. She was treated as a delicate, fragile creature, precious but restricted. Her virginity, in her father's eyes, was the most valuable thing she had to offer the world, and so he kept her hidden, away from prying eyes, preparing her for the day she would be married to a man who would take her from him. Her mother, Clara, was kind and loving, but even she couldn't protect Matilda from the chains her father had forged. Clara would often whisper to her in the evenings, offering words of comfort, but the truth was clear. Matilda's future had already been decided. She would marry, as all girls did, to serve and please a man. There was no room for her dreams, no space for her to even imagine a life outside the one her father had set out for her. Matilda's days blurred together. School was a brief escape, but even there, she felt the weight of her father's rules. While the other girls gossiped about boys, exchanged glances, and dreamed of the lives they would one day lead, Matilda kept to herself. She was always under her father's watchful eye, never allowed to partake in the innocence of youth. She learned to keep her thoughts to herself, to be quiet, obedient, and submissive. At night, when the world outside was still, Matilda would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would be like to have a life of her own. But those dreams were fleeting. She knew that the world outside her father's home was not for her. It was a world for boys to conquer, for men to build. As a girl, her destiny was already sealed. She had no voice, no choice. And as the years passed, she resigned herself to the fact that this was the life she would lead, forever bound by the expectations of a father who believed he knew what was best for her. And so, Matilda's life continued, a quiet existence in the shadows of her father's control. She was never asked what she wanted, never given the chance to dream. She was simply prepared to be the wife of a man she hadn't met, prepared to fulfill a role that was already defined for her. But what happens when a life of obedience is forced to collide with the harsh realities of adulthood? What happens when the life you've been prepared for suddenly becomes your prison? For Matilda, this moment was about to come, and it would change her life forever. Matilda's father, Walter Hayes, was a man shaped by a rigid sense of duty and a profound belief in tradition. He wasn't cruel, not in the way that would break bones or raise fists. But his cruelty was more subtle. It was the slow, steady pressure of control, the kind that twisted your heart and made you believe that what you were given was all you would ever deserve. In Walter's eyes, his daughter was not a person with dreams or desires. She was an asset to be safeguarded, a precious object to be traded when the time came. She was his property, and he held her like one holds a fine piece of china, delicate, valuable, but never to be touched, never to be free. From an early age, Matilda felt this unspoken message every time she looked into her father's eyes. Where other fathers might have seen their daughters as bright, curious souls, Walter saw only a woman in the making, a future wife, a person whose worth was determined by her purity and obedience. She was to stay chaste, to stay quiet, and to remain under his control until she was handed off to another man. In his eyes, it wasn't just a marriage. It was a transaction, a business deal that would secure the family's future. Walter wasn't a man given to affection in the way most people would recognize it. He didn't shower his daughter with kind words or praises. Instead, he demanded from her a sense of discipline, of duty. "A girl's place is inside the house," he would tell her, even as she watched her brothers run freely through the fields, laughing and shouting. They were allowed to roam, to explore, to live. But Matilda was a different case. She had no voice in the matter, no say in her own fate. Her daily life consisted of chores, sewing, cooking, sweeping the yard. She did this dutifully, as expected of her, without complaint. But the fire that once burned in her eyes slowly began to fade. Matilda, the little girl who had once dreamed of adventures, now found herself trapped within the confines of a life she never chose. And her father's cold, watchful eye was always there, reminding her that the world beyond their walls wasn't meant for her. As Matilda grew, so did the pressure. By the time she reached her teenage years, Walter's expectations had only become stricter. "A girl who plays in the street gets lost," he would tell her whenever she expressed any desire to join her brothers or the other children in the town square. It was an almost obsessive need to keep her under control. While her brothers were allowed to build relationships with their peers, Matilda was isolated, her interactions limited to her family and the narrow walls of the house. She learned early on that she wasn't to seek attention, that her beauty was something to be hidden, not flaunted. Her value was in her virginity, in her purity, in her ability to be the perfect wife one day. But the more she lived under her father's thumb, the more it became clear. She was being prepared for a life she didn't want. The societal norms of the time only reinforced her father's beliefs. Women were expected to marry, bear children, and serve their husbands. There was little room for personal growth or choice. Matilda's education was cut short at the age of 14, and from that point forward, her world became the home. She was no longer allowed to attend school, nor was she encouraged to dream about the future. Her father made sure that her life was mapped out for her, and the only path available was the one that led straight to marriage. "A decent girl marries young and marries well," Walter would say. But the idea of choosing her own husband was something Matilda could hardly comprehend. She didn't even know what love felt like, only the vague idea that it was something that would come with time, after marriage. Her brothers, each in turn, left the house as they grew older, becoming young men with careers and families of their own. Matilda, however, remained behind, her role solidifying with each passing year. She became the caretaker of the home, learning how to cook, clean, and maintain the house as her father saw fit. She learned how to be a perfect wife without ever being allowed to experience the world of courtship, of love, of choice. Her father had made sure of that. As Matilda's 18th birthday came and went, the whispers from the town began. People in the market would talk behind her back, questioning why such a pretty girl hadn't found a suitor. "What's wrong with her?" they would murmur, as if the silence surrounding her life was some kind of defect. But Matilda knew better. It wasn't that there was something wrong with her. It was that there was something wrong with how the world saw her. She wasn't allowed to make her own decisions, to choose a man, to explore life as others did. She was, in her father's eyes, too precious to be let out into the world. too fragile to experience what other girls did. And as the years passed, Matilda began to feel the weight of her father's expectations more and more. She would never have the freedom to fall in love with someone of her choosing. That right, that privilege, had been stripped away long ago, just like the other things in her life that had been decided for her. She had become, in every sense, a commodity to be sold, a daughter to be married off in exchange for security. She was not Matilda, the girl with dreams and hopes. She was Matilda, the daughter of Walter Hayes, the girl destined to fulfill her father's vision of what was best for her. But as time wore on, and as Matilda's life seemed to stretch out before her like an endless, silent road, the pressure to live up to her father's expectations became unbearable. She began to wonder if there was any way out, any escape from the life she had been trapped in. The thought terrified her. It was a thought she had never allowed herself to fully entertain. But one thing was certain. Matilda's life as it stood was no life at all. It was the life her father had chosen for her. And now, as she entered adulthood, she knew that it was time for her to be handed off to the next man in her life, a man who would control her as her father had done. Matilda had lived her entire life within the suffocating embrace of her father's control. She had grown used to it, though it never ceased to feel like an invisible chain that kept her bound to a future that wasn't her own. But nothing could have prepared her for what was about to happen, what her father, Walter Hayes, would decide for her in the face of desperation. It all started on an ordinary Thursday morning. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft golden light across the fields, when Walter's footsteps echoed in the hall. He entered Matilda's room with a heaviness in his step, and she immediately knew something was different. His usual sternness was replaced by an unusual nervousness, an emotion Matilda had rarely seen from him. As he closed the door behind him, the air grew thick with an unsettling tension. "Matilda, come sit down," he said, his voice more strained than usual. She obeyed without a word, her heart racing. For as long as she could remember, her father's words had always been law. But today, there was something in his tone that made her uneasy, something that hinted at a shift in the carefully laid-out plans he had for her. She sat at the small wooden table by the window, watching the sunlight play on the floorboards as Walter took a seat across from her. "I've been thinking," he began, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table, "about your future." Matilda's stomach dropped. She had long known that her future had already been decided, but the thought of it still filled her with a sense of dread. She tried to keep her face neutral, but she couldn't stop her mind from racing. Walter paused, as though trying to choose his words carefully. "The situation with the farm, well, it's getting worse. The crops have been poor, and the cattle aren't selling as they used to. There's no work coming in, and we've nearly run out of options." Matilda felt a cold knot tighten in her chest. Her father had always been proud to the point of stubbornness. But now there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never seen before. It was a silent admission that things were far worse than he was letting on. "I've made a decision," Walter continued, his gaze shifting away from her as though he couldn't bear to look her in the eye. "I've arranged for you to marry." Matilda blinked, unable to fully process the words. For all the years she had spent under her father's rule, she had always known this day would come. But the weight of it, the finality of it, hit her like a ton of bricks. "Marry?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who?" Her father's gaze shifted back to her, his face hardening slightly. "Arthur Shaw." The name struck her like a sudden gust of wind. Arthur Shaw. She had heard the name before, whispered in hushed tones by the town's gossips, but she knew little about him. He was a mystery to her, an enigma that had stirred rumors in Harmony Creek for as long as Matilda could remember. Arthur was nearly twice her age, 45 years old, and had lived alone for as long as anyone could remember. He owned a large farm on the outskirts of town, but rarely did anyone see him. He kept to himself, a solitary man who was spoken about in rumors more than in conversation. Some said he had a dark past, others whispered that he was hiding something sinister. He had no wife, no children, and was known to be a man of few words, whose wealth was as much a mystery as his character. "Arthur Shaw," Matilda repeated, her voice rising with confusion. Why him? Her father's eyes hardened, his tone growing more forceful. Because he's willing to marry you. Because he has the means to take care of you. And because, quite frankly, there's no one else. The farm's barely staying afloat. This is your future, Matilda. You will marry him. The words hit Matilda like a slap in the face. Her father had just handed her over to a man she didn't know. A man who was a stranger to her. A man who had no interest in her beyond what she could offer him. She felt a wave of nausea rise within her. The cold realization of what was happening flooding her mind. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why would you do this to me? I don't know him. I don't even know what he's like. How can you decide my future like this? Why can't I choose?" Her father's expression softened for a moment, but only a moment. He let out a heavy sigh and shook his head. "You don't have a choice. We don't have a choice. This is how it's done, Matilda. You don't get to choose. You get to live the life you've been given." She felt her heart break as the words landed. This is how it's done. In that moment, she understood fully the depth of her father's control. This wasn't just about securing a marriage. This was about ensuring that his pride, his reputation, and his way of life were preserved. Matilda was nothing more than a pawn, and she had no say in her own destiny. "But I'm not ready," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm only 20. I haven't even lived my life. I haven't seen the world. I haven't even been kissed by a boy." The words spilled out before she could stop them, a desperate attempt to grasp at something, anything, that might give her a sense of her own humanity. Walter's face twisted in frustration. "This isn't about love, Matilda. This is about survival. We don't have time for your dreams. You'll marry Arthur, and you'll make it work. You're a woman now, and this is what women do." Matilda stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She could barely breathe as the weight of her father's words settled over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. She wanted to scream, to run, to tear down the walls that had kept her locked away for so long. But she couldn't. She was trapped, bound by the very rules her father had instilled in her. As Walter stood to leave, Matilda's voice cracked. "What if I don't want to marry him? What if I don't want to be sold off like property?" Her father stopped at the door, his back to her. He didn't turn around. "You don't have a choice. You'll marry Arthur Shaw, and you'll thank me for it later." And with that, he left, leaving Matilda alone in the room, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and betrayal. She sank to her knees, her heart aching as the world around her seemed to close in. She had no say in her own life. She was not a person. She was a commodity to be exchanged, a pawn to be moved in the game of survival. The day of Matilda's wedding arrived with the quiet finality of a sentence being handed down. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty streets of Harmony Creek, as if even the day itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. But to Matilda, the sun seemed too bright, the air too thick, and the world too full of noise. The day was no longer a celebration. It was an end. Her childhood, her dreams, and her life as she knew it were slipping away, never to return. As her mother, Clara, helped her into the wedding dress, a gown of white satin and lace that had been bought with money her father could scarcely afford, Matilda felt herself drifting in a daze. The dress was beautiful, of course. It shimmered in the light as she moved, and the delicate lace trim made her feel like something out of a storybook. But no matter how pretty the dress, no matter how much her mother smiled through her tears, Matilda couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into a life she didn't choose. It was as though she were wearing the dress for someone else's dream, not her own. Her reflection in the mirror did little to comfort her. She barely recognized the girl staring back at her. Matilda, the girl who had once dreamed of running free in the fields, who had longed to experience life on her own terms, was now a woman cloaked in the trappings of tradition and duty. The soft curls of her brown hair framed her face, and her pale blue eyes seemed to lack their usual spark. She looked every bit the bride, but in her heart, she felt far from it. The dress, the veil, the shoes, they were just pieces of a costume, and she was playing a role she had never agreed to. Her father, Walter, walked in just as Clara was fastening the final button at the back of the dress. Matilda couldn't look him in the eye as he came to stand beside her, his face a mask of stoic pride. He didn't say anything at first, just looked at her with a distant expression, as if seeing her for the first time. "You look beautiful," he finally said, his voice thick with something Matilda couldn't place. Was it regret? Or simply the weight of a decision that had already been made long ago? "Thank you, Father," Matilda replied softly, the words falling from her lips without meaning. They sounded hollow, as though spoken by someone else. Walter nodded, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer before he turned and walked out of the room. His footsteps faded down the hallway, and Matilda was left standing there, alone with her mother. Clara reached out, her hands trembling as she adjusted Matilda's veil, the fabric so delicate it felt like the thinnest of silken webs. "You're a princess today, sweetheart," Clara whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek. "A princess who will marry her prince." But Matilda didn't feel like a princess. She didn't feel like anything at all. She felt numb, as if she were floating outside of herself, watching someone else live her life. The idea of marrying Arthur Shaw, a man she barely knew, felt like a nightmare. She had no say in it, no voice in the matter. Her father had made the decision, and she had no choice but to follow. As the moments passed, Matilda's mind wandered back to the life she could never have. The life that had been stripped from her before she even had the chance to dream it. She thought of the fields she would never run through, the boys she would never flirt with, the freedom she would never know. Her childhood had been spent in the prison of her father's control, and now, as a young woman, she was about to be handed over to another man who would control her just as her father had. The chains were just changing shape. The ceremony itself felt like a blur, a series of mechanical motions that carried her along, as though she were a passenger in her own life. The church was filled with people, neighbors, family friends, townfolk, all gathered to witness the union that had been arranged for her. The air was thick with the scent of roses and fresh linen, but it all felt so far away from her, as though the world were on the other side of a glass window, and she was locked outside, looking in. Matilda barely heard the priest's words as he read from the Bible, his voice a distant hum. "Do you take Arthur Shaw to be your lawful wedded husband?" The question hung in the air for a moment, and for a brief second Matilda thought about running, about bolting from the church and disappearing into the woods beyond. But the thought was fleeting. She was too far gone, too far down the path her father had set for her. "I do," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the organ. Arthur stood beside her, tall and solemn, his face a study in quiet strength. Matilda couldn't meet his gaze, but she felt his presence beside her, solid and unwavering. She had heard whispers about him, how he was a solitary man, an enigma to the town. Some said he had a dark past. Others said he was simply afraid of women. But now, standing beside him in the church, Matilda knew one thing for certain. He was just as much a prisoner as she was. Arthur didn't speak much during the ceremony, and Matilda found herself wondering what was going through his mind. Was he happy? Was he as scared as she was? She didn't know. All she knew was that he was the man her father had chosen for her, and now, in front of God and everyone, they were bound together. The reception, like the ceremony, passed in a blur. Matilda barely tasted the food, barely heard the laughter that filled the air. The people congratulated her, wished her happiness, but their words felt like the soft murmur of a distant crowd. Her heart was too full of dread, too full of sadness to care about the pleasantries. Her father stood in the corner, a proud smile on his face, watching her from a distance. He had done what he thought was best for her, but Matilda couldn't shake the feeling that she was a doll he had dressed up and handed off to the highest bidder. She caught glimpses of her mother, whose eyes were filled with silent tears. Clara's hands were clasped tightly together, as though she were holding on to something for dear life. Matilda saw the fear in her mother's eyes, fear for what was happening to her daughter, fear that Matilda's future was slipping through her fingers, just as it had slipped through her own. As the evening wore on, Matilda felt the weight of the night settle heavily on her shoulders. The music played and people danced, but she felt detached from it all, She wasn't there, not really. She was somewhere else, somewhere she couldn't reach, somewhere that was hers and hers alone. When the final song played and the guests began to leave, Matilda's father came up to her, his voice low and almost tender. "Time to go, Matilda. Arthur's waiting for you." Matilda's heart lurched in her chest. She nodded, her lips pressed together, and she followed her father out the door, toward the carriage waiting to take her to Arthur's house, the house that would now be hers. She was leaving the life she had known. Leaving her home, leaving her childhood. But the hardest part of all was knowing she was leaving it all behind without ever having had a choice. The night was thick with an unfamiliar stillness as the moonlight filtered through the curtains of the bedroom, casting pale shadows across the walls. Matilda stood by the window, her fingers lightly tracing the cool glass, her heart racing in her chest. She had spent the day in a haze, the weight of her father's decision pressing down on her like a stone lodged in her stomach. The wedding had ended, the guests had left, and now she found herself alone with Arthur Shaw, the man who had been chosen for her, the man who would be her husband, for better or for worse. Her mind was a blur of conflicting emotions, fear, dread, confusion. There had been no love between them, no understanding, only obligation. She had been traded, and now she was here, in this unfamiliar room, with a stranger who was supposed to become her partner in life. She had expected a night of cold duty, perhaps a quiet silence as they both lay in the bed, strangers under the same roof. But what she didn't expect, what she couldn't have prepared for, was the moment that would change everything. Arthur was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to her, his hands folded in his lap, his shoulders hunched in a way that made him look smaller, vulnerable. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a quiet strength about him. But in that moment, Matilda saw only the fragility of a man who carried the weight of a lifetime of secrets. "Matilda." His voice was low, almost hesitant as if he was unsure of how to begin, unsure of how to break the silence that had settled between them. "There's something I need to tell you." She turned slowly, her gaze locking on him, her heart suddenly pounding louder in her chest. The dread that had been creeping up her spine now swelled, and her mind raced with 100 different thoughts. What could it be? What does he want to tell me? But she had no way of knowing the truth that Arthur was about to reveal. Arthur shifted uncomfortably on the bed, his hands twitching as he gathered his thoughts. For a moment, it was as if he was searching for the right words, words that could explain the unexplainable. Then finally he spoke again, and the weight of his words dropped like a heavy stone. "I'm not like other men, Matilda," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He turned to face her then, his eyes filled with a deep vulnerability that she had not expected. "I never have been. I've lived with this shame for most of my life, and it's something I can never change, something I've hidden away, until now." Matilda's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her heart racing as her mind struggled to process what he was saying. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask him what he meant, but the words stuck in her throat. All she could do was stare at him, her eyes wide with confusion. Arthur sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years of isolation. "I'm not able to be like other men in the way that matters. I don't know how to say this, but it's something you need to understand before we move forward." He hesitated, his voice thick with shame. "Matilda, I was born different. I was born with a condition that I've kept hidden my entire life. Something that, well, it makes me less of a man in the eyes of others." Matilda's stomach tightened. Her mind was racing, but the room seemed to have grown quieter, colder. What could he possibly mean? She didn't understand. The words seemed to tumble around her, jumbled and foreign, and yet in the depths of Arthur's eyes, she could see the weight of his confession, the pain he was carrying. Arthur's voice trembled as he continued, his gaze never leaving hers. "I was born with a physical condition that makes me different from other men. My private parts they're not like what you might expect. They're smaller, much smaller than they should be." He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "I've lived my whole life hiding it, afraid that someone would discover it, that someone would see me as less of a man. I've never been with a woman, not like other men. I've never had the courage to be intimate. Matilda stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the words slowly began to sink in. Her first reaction was shock, utter, stunned disbelief. She had never expected this. She had prepared herself for a life of quiet obedience, of duty, of submitting to a man she barely knew. But this was something she had never even considered. She watched as Arthur sat there, his shoulders slumped, his hands clenched tightly in his lap. He was so different from the man she had imagined. He wasn't the monster she had feared, the cold, unfeeling man who had purchased her. No, he was just a man, vulnerable, full of shame, carrying a burden that she could not have understood until now. For a long moment, Matilda didn't know what to say. She was flooded with emotions, shock, confusion, even a strange sense of empathy. Arthur, the man she had been forced to marry, wasn't just a stranger. He was someone who had suffered, who had lived his life with the same shame and fear that she had lived with. Though in a different way, her heart softened, and the coldness that had gripped her chest began to thaw. Slowly, she took a step forward, her feet light as she approached the bed where Arthur sat. She knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his arm, a simple gesture of comfort that felt like the only thing she could offer. "You're not less of a man, Arthur," she whispered, her voice soft but steady. "You're still a man who is kind, who has a heart. That's what matters, not what's between your legs." Arthur looked at her, his eyes wide with surprise, as if he hadn't expected such a response. For a moment he didn't speak, and Matilda wondered if he had even heard her. But then, he reached out, his hand trembling as it took hers. "I never thought you'd understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I never thought anyone could." Matilda squeezed his hand gently, offering him a small, reassuring smile. "I may not understand everything, Arthur, but I do know one thing. We're both victims of our circumstances, and we don't have to suffer alone. We can figure this out. Together." For the first time since their wedding, Matilda felt a small flicker of hope. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was the beginning of something new, a partnership built on honesty, respect, and the willingness to face the pain and shame together. The days following the wedding passed in a haze of awkward silences and uncomfortable glances. Matilda had never imagined that her first days as a married woman would feel so empty, so distant. The house, Arthur's house, was large and beautiful, with high ceilings, polished wood floors, and soft carpets beneath her feet. The walls, adorned with old paintings and antique furniture, spoke of wealth and history, of a life that had been lived alone, without anyone to share it with. But to Matilda, the house felt cold and unwelcoming. It was a strange place, unfamiliar and foreign, where every corner seemed to whisper of the man she had just married, a man she barely knew. The rooms were silent, save for the occasional sound of Arthur's footsteps as he moved through the house, always careful, always distant. It was as though they were two strangers thrown together by fate, and neither of them knew how to bridge the gap between them. The first few nights were the hardest. Matilda found herself lying awake in the large, unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft sound of Arthur's breathing from across the room. The bed was spacious, almost too much so for two people who were supposed to share it, but the space between them felt more like an ocean than a mere distance. There were no words, no comfort to be found in the silence. There was only the overwhelming sense of being trapped, of being held in a situation she couldn't control. Arthur, too, seemed to carry the weight of their new reality with him. In the evenings, he would retreat to the study, his eyes distant, his movements slow and deliberate. He spent hours there, reading through papers, organizing old ledgers, his work offering him a kind of solace, an escape from the discomfort of their shared living space. Matilda couldn't help but notice how he seemed to avoid her, as though he didn't know how to act, how to bridge the distance between them. He was kind, never unkind, but he remained a stranger in her eyes. During the day, the house felt like a cavern of solitude. Matilda moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, but the weight of her situation sat heavily on her shoulders. She wasn't sure how to interact with Arthur. There were no gentle words, no moments of tenderness. There were only awkward exchanges when they passed each other in the hallway, brief glances over the breakfast table, and silence hanging in the air like a thick fog. They were two people bound by necessity, but they were also two people who had no idea how to start the life they were now supposed to live together. The first real conversation came one evening, as the two of them sat at the long wooden table in the dining room, eating a simple meal of roasted chicken and vegetables. The conversation had been stilted at first, both of them picking at their food, avoiding eye contact, the awkwardness palpable. But as the meal progressed, something shifted. Matilda could feel it in the air, as though both of them were finally ready to break the silence. Arthur put down his fork, his eyes lingering on the plate in front of him. "This is strange," he said quietly, his voice tinged with frustration. "I've never been good at this. At being with someone, at sharing a life with someone." Matilda blinked, surprised by the confession. She had always viewed Arthur as a man who had it all together. A man who, despite his isolation, seemed to have everything under control. But now, in this quiet moment, she saw him for what he truly was. A man as lost and unsure as she was. "I know," she replied softly, her voice low, as if afraid of shattering the fragile moment. "I feel it too. It's like we're both strangers here." Arthur's gaze lifted, meeting hers for the first time in what felt like days. His eyes were weary, filled with a sadness that mirrored her own. "I didn't expect it to be like this," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I thought I'd be okay. I thought I could handle it, but I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a husband, not really." Matilda felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time, she wasn't the only one who felt lost. Arthur, too, was struggling. He, too, was grappling with the reality of their marriage, of the life they had been thrust into. "Neither do I," she said, her voice small but steady. "I didn't think it would be like this either. I thought I would feel different. That something would change." Arthur nodded, his face softening, his expression vulnerable. "I know, I thought we'd be something more than this. Something real." He paused, his gaze dropping again to the table. "I've never had a family. I've never had a wife. I've spent my whole life alone, and now here you are. And I don't know what to do with that." Matilda's heart ached as she listened to his words. She had always viewed Arthur as a man of mystery, someone who had it all figured out, someone who was just too different from her to ever understand. But now, sitting across from him, she saw him in a different light. He wasn't just the man who had bought her out of necessity. He was a man who had spent his life in isolation, who had never learned what it meant to share his life with someone else. He was just as much a victim of circumstance as she was. "I didn't choose this," Matilda whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. "I didn't choose any of this. I didn't choose you. I didn't choose this life, but maybe we can make it work. Maybe we can figure this out together." Arthur looked at her, his eyes searching hers as though trying to read the truth of her words. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't heavy with fear and doubt. It was filled with something else, something softer, something that held the possibility of change. "You're right," Arthur said finally, his voice more certain. "Maybe we can make this work. Maybe we can learn to live together, to understand each other." Matilda nodded, feeling a quiet hope begin to stir in her chest. It wasn't much, but it was something. A glimmer of light in the midst of all the darkness that had surrounded her since the wedding. For the first time since that fateful day, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to make this marriage work. As the evening wore on, the conversation continued, the awkwardness slowly giving way to a tentative friendship. They spoke of their pasts, Arthur's lonely childhood, Matilda's oppressive upbringing, and shared the fears and insecurities that had shaped them into the people they were. It wasn't a love story, not yet, but it was a beginning built on vulnerability, on shared struggles, on the quiet understanding that neither of them had chosen this life, but they would have to live it together, for better or worse. The early days of Matilda and Arthur's marriage were marked by a strange kind of stillness, an uneasy silence that filled the house and hung heavy in the air. But as the weeks passed, the atmosphere slowly began to shift. At first, it was subtle, an unnoticed glance here, a shared smile there. The awkwardness between them began to fade, not because it disappeared entirely, but because it became something they both learned to navigate. Slowly, the walls that had separated them started to crumble, piece by piece, as they began to understand each other in a way neither had expected. It was Arthur who took the first step. He began to involve Matilda in the daily activities of the farm, not because he felt obligated, but because he saw her as more than just a wife he had bought out of necessity. One afternoon, while he was tending to the cattle, he called her over. "Matilda," he said, his voice soft but firm, "you want to learn how to handle the livestock?" Matilda was surprised. She had never been involved in farm work before. Her father had never allowed her to do anything more than simple chores around the house. But here, in Arthur's world, things were different. He wasn't the demanding, controlling man she had once feared. Instead, he offered her a chance to do something, to contribute, to be part of the world around her. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, feeling a mixture of excitement and uncertainty. "But I'm willing to try." Arthur smiled, and for the first time since their wedding, Matilda saw a warmth in his eyes. "It's not too hard. You'll get the hang of it. I'll show you." The next few weeks were a blur of activity. Arthur taught her how to care for the animals, how to mend the fences, how to plant the crops that would feed them through the winter. At first, Matilda stumbled, unsure of herself and clumsy with the tools. But with every passing day, she grew more confident, more capable. She learned to handle the animals with care, to read the subtle signs of their needs, and to work with the land in a way that felt natural, even if it was foreign to her. She found satisfaction in the work, a sense of purpose she had never known before. And as they worked side by side, Matilda began to see Arthur in a new light. He wasn't just a man she had been sold to. He was a man who, despite his many flaws, had built a life for himself from nothing. He was a man who cared deeply for the farm, for the animals, for the land. His work ethic was undeniable. And in those quiet moments when they labored together, Matilda began to feel something she had never expected: respect. They weren't just two people forced together by circumstances anymore. They were becoming partners in a way that felt natural. They spoke more freely now, their conversations no longer strained but filled with curiosity and genuine interest. Matilda learned of Arthur's childhood, the loneliness he had endured, the struggles he had faced growing up without the love or companionship of a family. Arthur, in turn, listened as Matilda spoke of her own life, her years spent under her father's strict control, her dreams that had been stifled by expectations she could never meet. One evening, as they sat together on the porch after a long day of work, Matilda opened up to him in a way she never thought she could. "I never thought I'd end up here," she said softly, her voice tinged with a mixture of sadness and wonder. "I thought I was meant for something different. I thought I was going to be, I don't know, someone else. But now I don't know who I am anymore." Arthur looked at her with understanding in his eyes, his expression softening. "I know what you mean. For the longest time, I thought I was supposed to be something I wasn't. I spent so many years hiding from who I really was. But this life, this place, it's changed me. It's changed us." Matilda turned to face him, her heart swelling with a strange mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she had not yet allowed herself to feel. "I'm starting to think that maybe we're both here for a reason," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe we're supposed to learn something from each other." Arthur nodded, his eyes reflecting a deep sadness, but also a quiet hope. "Maybe we are." As the days turned into weeks, Matilda's transformation became more evident. She had started as a reluctant wife, a girl trapped by circumstances beyond her control, but now she was growing into a woman who saw her own potential. The work on the farm, the quiet moments spent reading books she had never dared to pick up before, the growing understanding between her and Arthur. These things were changing her. Slowly, she was finding her voice, her strength, her sense of self. Arthur, too, was changing. The more he shared with her, the more vulnerable he became. The more he began to see her as a partner, not just a wife. They were no longer just two strangers in an arranged marriage. They were becoming a team. The emotional distance that had once separated them was fading, replaced by a bond that neither of them had expected. Matilda began to realize something else, too. For the first time in her life, she felt like she was in control of something. She wasn't just living to please others anymore. She was living for herself. This marriage, though unconventional, could be the start of something she controlled. She had never thought she could have any say in her own life. But now, as she worked side by side with Arthur, she saw that she had the power to shape her own destiny. Her mind wandered back to the days of her childhood, to the suffocating grip of her father's control. And for the first time, she felt no fear, no regret. She had spent so many years fighting against her fate. But now, she saw that the life she had with Arthur could be something different. It wasn't the life she had imagined for herself, but it was her life. And that, for the first time, gave her peace. One morning, as they stood together in the barn, working to feed the animals, Matilda turned to Arthur, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady, "I think we're doing all right. Don't you?" Arthur paused, his hand on the feed bag, and looked at her with a soft smile of his own. "I think we are," he replied. "I think we're doing just fine." And in that moment, Matilda realized something profound. She had started this journey as a prisoner of circumstance, but she was beginning to see that, in some ways, she had freed herself. Not through escaping, not through running away, but through the quiet acceptance of the life she was building with Arthur. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And for the first time, she felt truly alive. Matilda had often heard the word love used in the town, whispered between girls at church, flaunted by the young couples in the square, and celebrated in the stories her mother once told. Love in those stories was always a passionate thing, full of fire, desire, and an undeniable pull between two people. But that kind of love had never felt like something that was meant for her. It was something reserved for others, something that only existed in the world of fairy tales, where the princess met her prince, and they lived happily ever after. For Matilda, love had always been a distant idea, something that she would never experience. At first, her marriage to Arthur seemed to reflect everything she feared: an arrangement, a transaction, a cold and lifeless union between two strangers. But as time wore on, as they spent more days together on the farm, more nights under the same roof, something unexpected began to blossom between them. It wasn't love as Matilda had imagined it, not the kind of love you read about in books or see in the movies. It wasn't dramatic, and it certainly wasn't instant, but it was something real, something built on trust, mutual respect, and the quiet understanding that grew between them like the steady growth of a plant, nurtured by the same hands every day. Arthur was no longer the mysterious man she had married out of necessity. He wasn't just the man who had bought her to save his own loneliness, as she had once thought. No, he had become something more, something deeper. He had become her partner in every sense of the word. He was the man who had shared his vulnerabilities with her, the man who had shown her respect when she had expected none. In return, she had opened up to him, allowing him to see the parts of her that she had kept hidden for so long. The fear, the hurt, the loneliness that had defined her childhood. Together, they had built a foundation of trust, a trust that had been forged not through passion or physical attraction, but through the quiet, everyday acts of partnership. They worked side by side, day in and day out, managing the farm, tending to the animals, and planning for the future. In the quiet moments when they shared a meal or worked together in the fields, Matilda began to realize that this was what love truly was. Not a fiery passion, but a steady, unwavering support that grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself leaning on Arthur in ways she never thought she would. She found herself looking to him for strength, for guidance, and, more often than not, finding it. In return, Arthur had come to rely on Matilda too. Her presence in his life had changed him in ways he had not anticipated. He had spent so many years hiding from the world, ashamed of his past and his physical struggles. But with Matilda by his side, he no longer felt the need to hide. They had built something together, not just a marriage, but a partnership that was based on mutual respect and a deep, quiet understanding. And as they shared their days, their dreams, and their fears, they began to realize that their love was something different, something uniquely theirs. It wasn't about grand gestures or passion. It was about showing up for each other day after day, through the struggles and the triumphs. It was about knowing that no matter what life threw at them, they would face it together. But not everyone understood their love. The town, with its narrow views and judgmental whispers, was quick to scrutinize them. Matilda could hear the gossip as she walked through the market, people muttering behind her back, questioning why a young woman like her had married a man so much older, so much more isolated. There were those who whispered that it was unnatural, that it wasn't right for a woman her age to be married to someone like Arthur. But Matilda paid them no mind. She had long since stopped caring about what others thought of her marriage. What mattered was that Arthur had become her rock, and she had become his. Together, they had weathered the storms of life, not as two people bound by obligation, but as two people who had found something real in the quiet moments they shared. It was a love that didn't need validation from anyone else. It was a love that stood firm against the judgment of others. A love that had been built on understanding, trust, and above all, resilience. Arthur, too, had begun to find strength in Matilda. He had spent so many years alone, burdened by his own shame and isolation, that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone to lean on. But Matilda had taught him that vulnerability was not weakness, it was strength. She had shown him that it was okay to be imperfect, to not have all the answers, to ask for help when needed. With Matilda by his side, Arthur was no longer the solitary man he had been. He had found a partner in every sense of the word, but the hardship wasn't over. They still faced the challenges of a world that didn't always understand their marriage. The town's judgment, though quieter now, still lingered in the background. But Matilda and Arthur had learned to face it together. The whispers and stares didn't matter anymore. They had each other. They had their shared moments, their quiet understanding, and the deep, unwavering love that had grown between them despite the odds. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Matilda turned to Arthur, her voice filled with quiet conviction. "I never thought it would be like this," she said, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "I thought I would always be alone, always trapped in a life that wasn't mine. But now I see that love doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to fit some ideal. It just has to be real. And this is real." Arthur looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that matched the quiet strength of their bond. "I never thought I'd find this either. I thought I'd be alone forever. But you've shown me that love doesn't need to be something grand or spectacular. It just has to be built, and we've built something worth fighting for." They sat in silence for a while, the soft sounds of the evening surrounding them. The world had quieted, but inside the small house they had built together, a new understanding had been born. It wasn't the kind of love Matilda had once dreamed of, but it was a love that had stood the test of time. It was a love built on the foundation of respect, understanding, and the quiet strength of two people who had learned to choose each other day after day. And for Matilda, that was enough. As the years passed, Matilda and Arthur's bond grew stronger, deepening into something beautiful, something that transcended the circumstances of their union. They had been brought together by necessity, yes, but what had blossomed between them was far more than just survival. It was a quiet, steady partnership based on mutual respect, trust, and love. Love that wasn't about grand declarations or fiery passion, but about the unspoken support they gave each other every day. And yet, even as their bond grew, something was missing. Matilda had spent her life yearning for freedom, for a life that was hers to shape. But as she and Arthur continued to build their life together, she realized that there was more to their love than just the two of them. There was the possibility of a family that they could create together. They had always known that children would never come to them in the traditional way. Arthur's condition made it impossible for them to have biological children, and for a long time, they had accepted that. But then, one day, they both agreed that their home, their love, had room for more. They decided to adopt. It wasn't an easy decision, nor one they made lightly. The process was long, filled with paperwork and waiting, and there were moments of doubt along the way. But each step brought them closer to the dream of building a family together. And it was through this journey that Matilda learned a profound lesson about love. She had always been taught that love came in one form, that it was tied to marriage, to children born from your own flesh. But as they welcomed their first adopted child into their home, a little girl named Ella, Matilda realized that love wasn't bound by biology. Love was something that grew, something that was nurtured by choice and by action. She had chosen Arthur, and he had chosen her. Now, together, they were choosing to build a family, not because it was expected, but because it was what they both wanted. Ella came to them with wide eyes and a fearful heart, much like Matilda had all those years ago, when she had first arrived at Arthur's house. The difference, of course, was that Matilda now had the strength to offer Ella something she hadn't had: a voice, a choice, and the freedom to be whoever she wanted to be. As Matilda held the tiny girl in her arms for the first time, she felt something stir within her, a fierce, protective love that came from a place deeper than she had ever known. Over the years, Matilda and Arthur adopted more children, each one bringing their own unique light to the home. Liam, a 5-year-old boy with a bright smile and a loud laugh, and Mia, a 2-year-old who had been abandoned at the doorstep of an orphanage, became part of their family, filling the house with the sounds of joy, laughter, and the occasional chaos. Matilda marveled at how far she had come. She had started her life as a girl sold into marriage, powerless and bound by circumstances. But now she was a mother, a strong, respected woman who had built a family not from obligation, but from love. She had learned that love came in many forms. It was a partnership, it was a choice, and it was something that could heal even the deepest wounds. She had once been a prisoner of her circumstances, but now she was free. She had the power to shape her own destiny, and that was the legacy she hoped to pass on to her children. It's funny how life comes full circle, Matilda thought as she sat on the rocking chair on the porch, her gaze drifting over the land she and Arthur had worked so hard to build. The fields were green and lush, the farmhouse standing tall against the horizon, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and growth. It was a peaceful evening, and though Arthur had passed away years ago, his presence still lingered in the very bones of the house. Now, at 77 years old, Matilda found herself surrounded by her children and grandchildren, each one a testament to the life she had built, a life that was far from perfect, but one that had been filled with love, respect, and choice. Her grandchildren ran around the yard, laughing and playing, the sound of their voices filling the air, and Matilda couldn't help but smile. She was no longer the frightened young girl who had been sold by her father. She was no longer the woman who had married a stranger out of necessity. She was a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had chosen her own path, who had built a legacy of love that transcended all the pain and hardships of her past. As she watched her grandchildren play, one of them, a curious 5-year-old girl, came over and climbed into her lap. "Grandma," the little girl asked, her eyes wide with innocence, "will you tell me your story again? The one about how you met Grandpa Arthur?" Matilda chuckled softly, brushing a few gray strands of hair from the child's face. "Of course, sweetie," she said, her voice gentle but steady. "You know, my story isn't one of grand romance or fairy tale endings, but it's the story of how love can grow in the most unexpected ways. It's the story of how, when life doesn't give you what you expect, you find strength in the choices you make." She paused, her thoughts drifting back to those early years, to the struggles and the pain, and to the moment when she realized that life didn't have to be perfect for it to be beautiful. "When I was younger, I didn't think I had any control over my life. I thought I was destined for a life of misery, of being sold off like property. But I learned that even when you feel trapped, even when it seems like there's no way out, you can always choose how to live your life. You can always choose to love, to respect yourself, and to build something that matters." Matilda looked around at her family, her heart swelling with pride. "You see, my dear, the greatest lesson I can give you is this. You have the power to rewrite your story. No matter what life throws at you, you have the power to choose your own path." The little girl snuggled closer, a contented smile on her face. I want to be like you, Grandma. Strong, like you. Matilda's heart warmed as she held her granddaughter close, a soft tear slipping down her cheek. You already are, my dear. You already are. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Matilda felt a deep sense of peace settle in her heart. She had lived a life filled with unexpected twists, hardships, and heartache. But she had also lived a life full of love. A love that was not bound by expectations, but one that was chosen every single day. And with that, she knew that her legacy would live on, not just in the stories she told, but in the lives of the children and grandchildren she had raised, the love they shared, and the choices they would make in their own lives. If you've ever felt trapped by your circumstances, know that you have the power to rewrite your story. Please subscribe to hear more incredible stories of resilience and love.